is co-sponsoring this talk along with the Library and Information Studies, in particular the Breslauer Professor Fund. And I'm very glad to have Nishant Shah here as a guest to give a talk on some of the research that he's been doing. He's been in the States for the last 3 weeks or so, and this is his final official talk, but there will be more unofficial talks right after and continuing until he leaves, I guess, on Sunday. So Nishant is the co-founder and director of research at the Bangalore-based Center for Internet and Society, which is of a similar name to such a center in the States, but is not formally affiliated. And he studies questions of governance, identity, planning, and body at the intersections of digital technologies, law, and everyday cultural practice. And he recently co-edited a 4-volume book series, Digital Alternatives with a Cause, ? Digital Alternatives with a Cause. Copies of which he's going to show, I guess, covers for those. And we may be interested in getting copies of those for our library here if we don't already have it. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nishant. And we are recording this as sort of an experiment, and we'll try to make it available to the public for those who couldn't make it today. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it on such a nice day.
Right, thank you. It's fantastic to be here. It's always fun for us to talk to an audience which is not familiar with our work at all, because then apart from factual research and observations, I can also pass off hypothetical fantasies to you, and let's see how you resonate with them. We kind of started this work called Digital Natives with a Cause about 3.5 years ago with a partner in Netherlands called HEWAS. And one of the ambitions of the project was actually to look at what the future is going to look like when we talk about technologies. So it was a really interesting challenge because it wasn't necessarily trying to account for the contemporary, but trying to unpack the contemporary in order to look at what the future is going to look like. Except that every fiber of your being kind of is shaken when you were trained as a social scientist or within cultural studies to speculate about the future, because we're so much more comfortable talking about the histories. So what I'm going to present to you is Terry Pratchett's version of future. Does anybody read Terry Pratchett? A fantasy writer. Pratchett has a beautiful inversion of time. In one of his Discourse writings, he suggests that we have our orientation of time wrong. We believe that the past is behind us and the future is in front of us, which is really a very stupid way of looking at things, simply because the past is actually what we can see and the future is what we cannot. So we are actually heading backwards in time, and the future is what we really don't know what about. And I'm going to try and look at a little bit of history, a little bit of the future, and a little bit of the contemporary, and try to see what we are being able to see in the future right now. So the project is called Digital Natives with a Cause. One of the outcomes of it is actually called Decoding Digital Natives, which was produced by the Center for Internet and Society early last September. These are all products which are available online for a free download, so I don't really have copies to give out, but if you are interested in what I'm saying, then you're most welcome to just go onto our website and get them from there. And as Annalie was saying, we also have a very generous funder who's allowed us to ship free copies to anybody who wants it. So at the end of the presentation, I will have my email address displayed, and if you are interested, just write to me and I will send the physical copies to you. All right, but after all that shameless plugs, let's actually go into what is this peculiar category called a digital native. Is this a term that's been very familiar to you? Digital native? One of the experiments that we constantly do is there anybody in this room who first claims to be a digital native? No? The acid test for figuring out whether you are a digital native or not is that if I show you an audio tape, remember those things? If I show you an audio tape and I give you a pen, and if you can make the connection between the two, then you are not a digital native. If you cannot make that connection, you should come and join the group of people I work with who say things like, what is side B? Or sometimes, and very horrifyingly, recently a 12-year-old who looked at me and said, "You're talking about blogging?" And I said, "Yeah, isn't that like in?" She said, "How old are you, 30? I said, "Yes, why?" And she said, "Because people about 25 talk about blogging. Blogging is so 20th century." And I stared at her and said, well, you can legitimately say that because you weren't born in the 20th century. Yeah. But a lot of the conversations around digital natives are essentially of this nature. They are youth-based. They talk about this increasingly unbridgeable generation gap about people who were born, if Mark Prensky has to be believed, people who were born after the 1980s, but people who were born digital, so to speak. People who did not have to transition from the analog into the digital world at any given point of time. And so, if you start looking at the discourse around digital natives, you start realizing that there is this overwhelming sense of how they are relating to the world in such different ways that they do not have anything in common with all of us who had to either become digital immigrants or settlers of certain kinds. Yeah? That if you look at the primary discourse on digital natives, you will realize that young people are interested in 5 main things. Texting, sexting, cyberbullying, piracy, and remix. That's just about it. That's all that they do. And this can kind of map onto all kinds of anxiety which come in from different people, right? So if you are teaching undergraduate students, you are saying, this copy-paste generation which doesn't really read anything, they just copy and paste, and it's a remix, right? But it's remix and plagiarism put together. Or if you look at bureaucrats, they are saying, oh, the young people are so entrenched in apathy, they are no longer interested in political mobilizations, despite the fact that you are seeing massive examples of people mobilizing themselves, and we're going to try and programatize them. So our project was essentially to say that if young people are not merely digital natives, but if digital natives is one of the identities that they wear because of certain kinds of practices that they engage with, then how do we start looking at them differently? And also, what is the kind of digital native who is not in the global developed north, who does not have ubiquitous access to technologies, who cannot afford the digital connectivity at all given times, when we cannot take either language or access or affordability as taken for granted in understanding the relationships with the world. So the project kind of draws from building knowledge networks and conversations in 3 continents across the global south, largely South and East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. And a lot of the work I'm going to present today is cannibalizing upon all those many, many conversations which have happened in the last 3.5 years. So I will not take credit for all the knowledge, especially the one I cannot defend when you ask me questions, and attribute it to somebody else. Right, but let's start looking at a certain other imagination of the digital native, right? And this is something that has really cropped up in the last couple of years, especially with Middle East and North Africa uprisings, the different kinds of movements that you are experiencing in the US, which now go under the Occupy Everything movement, the certain kinds of resistances and revolutions which are being staged in Asia and different parts of the world right now. If we go through these different kinds of images, this is from Syria, this is one of the most iconic moments from Libya right now. Tahrir Square, which is also quite familiar to all of us. The UC Davis experience should be particularly bringing things to home for you. Just as a side, I managed to see this meme of a pepper spraying policeman, which I think was the most fantastic outcome of the Occupy Davis that came out. Do search for the pepper spraying policeman meme, and you will find incredible pictures around that. Or this particular image from India, if you're familiar with the India Against Corruption campaigns which have been happening in 2011. So just to get a sense of how we are going to start characterizing these forms of massive citizen action movements, right? On the one hand, you have this anxiety about these young people who, as I said, are only interested in texting, sexting, bullying, and so on. And on the other, you have these young people who are suddenly reproducing themselves as extremely engaged citizens who are taking onto the streets and making extraordinary demands of rights, of equity, of justice, and so on and so forth. How I'm going to bridge these two is a separate question, and that's something that I don't have answers for. But what I really want to do for this talk is start to look at these different kinds of words which have been thrown around so easily in terms of Facebook revolutions and Twitter revolutions and BlackBerry revolutions and so on. That we need to start looking at what are the ways in which we are going to problematize the terms that these kinds of images bring forward to you. This overdetermination of technology as the only catalyst for change, and that the new modes of engagement, of participation, of critical interventions that people are making because of technology, how we can start looking at and understanding them in different ways. That when did we reach an age where technology had actually more agency than human beings? And I want to say that some of the ways by which we have been characterizing these forms of citizen action, unwillingly or otherwise, are often just reduced to what the technologies enable in those particular conditions, right? So if we had to look at this confluence of youth, technology, and change, there are two things which we always unpack really fast. One is the question of youth. Who is young? Who is enabled to be young? What are the kinds of young bodies which come onto the streets? It's also straightforward questions of the haves and the have-nots, about how we need to educate the young, we need to rehabilitate the young, we need to teach the young. There are all kinds of things which get unpacked really fast. The second thing that we unpack is the question of technology. This essentially takes two directions. One is a direction where we make a list of all the different platforms and gadgets which can be used to produce citizen action or change in the world, right? In fact, I now know of people who have visiting cards which say revolution managers, where they actually go to different NGOs and civil society organizations and help them build up digital infrastructure for creating a change. It's a blueprint. Start a Facebook account, get a Twitter hashtag, get a YouTube channel, etc., etc., etc. And the other ways in which we unpack the technologies is something that I'm more interested in, which is this throwing around of different kinds of buzzwords like collaboration and participation and P2P and so on and so forth. And I want to look at how we might be able to complicate this particular scenario. I'm suggesting to you that one of the ways by which technology revolutions or technology change has been characterized right now has been through these three tropes. The question of voice, the question of amplification, and the question of power. To be very, very reductive about it, the question of voice is essentially about how technology has enabled for alternative voices to emerge as ways by which they can be heard, that there is a certain visibility that's given to them, that outside of mainstream media there is this now huge plethora of people who are suddenly saying things which need to be recognized and acknowledged, right? Amplification is largely the question of scale, about how 10 years ago what might have been very, very local phenomena are suddenly becoming global spectacles. We have this extraordinary access to put out our voices in ways which were unprecedented, both in terms of scale as well as in time. And the third and the most contested category is that of power, and that's what I'm going to kind of address for this presentation. Saying what really happens when voice and amplification comes to an end. Because in the last 3 years of revolutions, we have also now witnessed this extraordinary thing where a lot of promises were made of different kinds of revolutions which never really got materialized in terms of what they intended to do. That there has been a production of crisis around most of the citizen action. So that the citizen action happens, but it doesn't really lead to anything extraordinary or concrete in its aftermath. One of the examples that I have from India is the Anna Hazare campaign, or India's fight against corruption. Is this something that's come up in discussion for you? Can I just show you a brief video to just give you a sense of the immense amount of mobilization that has happened around this idea that there is an increased amount of corruption in the Indian bureaucracy and the political society, and that we now, and I want you to really pay attention to this, we now want a right not to be affected by corruption within politics in India. Mm-hmm. It is the strangest formulation of the right ever, right? It is also, the collaboration is called India Against Corruption, as if hypothetically there was this evil India which is for corruption, and we are fighting it, right? This moving target where anybody who can be even remotely a critique or outside of me can suddenly become a target that I push. But the Anna Hazare campaign has been interesting because it draws from iconography of nation building during the colonial fight that we had in terms of getting independence. But it also is the only instance of mass mobilization that India has seen outside of a cricket series. The last time so many people came to the streets together to claim Indianness to themselves was when we won the Indian World Cup, Cricket World Cup, right? Apart from that, there has been no significant mobilization. Despite all that, in 7 short months, this campaign has entirely disappeared from public discourse. Nothing's happened. And I just want to give you a sense of the excitement and the promises that the campaign had. It has a non-English soundtrack, but most of the signs that you will see are actually in English, so I'm not going to waste any time in translations around that. Stop it, but just wanted to give you a sense of the extraordinary amount of excitement that it has generated within the country. I'm going to use this particular instance to talk about 5 different case studies and try and look at and unpack some of these things which have been so easily associated with this campaign, but also campaigns like that which had a radical potential for change, or at least had the language of a radical potential for change. So questions of mobilization, questions of participation, questions of peer-to-peer, questions of collaboration. How are we going to start unpacking all of these things? Let me begin with, perhaps the good news first, which is like, let's say, some of the more interesting campaigns which have led to some kinds of success or some kinds of effect in different countries. So I'm drawing now from, this is the book that we came out with. It's Digital Alternatives with a Cause. It's divided into 4 volumes. And I'm drawing case studies from there to try and start complicating this particular picture. The first case study I have for you is something that's now become a textbook case for how to organize a campaign in the third world. I think it's being taught in Harvard somewhere. Has anybody come across the pink chaddi campaign or the pink underwear campaign? People are familiar with it? I'll spend a very brief time trying to tell you the story. So the pink underwear campaign basically started because in the state where Bangalore is, which is called Karnataka, which is also where I live, we had the right-wing political party BJP coming into power a couple of years ago. And they decided that one of the things that they should install is new appreciation for Indian culture. They decided that women who wear short clothes, go to bars, date, smoke, or drink are against Indian culture. And so they did what apparently their interpretation of Indian culture is, which is just went into public and started beating up women. It led to very little press attention or notice. It became just yet another case of sexual or gendered violence that happens in the country, and nothing was done about it. But because nothing was done about it, a 27-year-old girl called Nisha Susan started a consortium of loose and pub-going women, which invited different people to come and say that I am loose and I am pub-going and I'm still Indian and I value Indian cultures and you can do this to me. Because of the consortium, they started something called the Pink Chaddi campaign. The chaddi is the Hindi word for underwear, where they invited people of India to send pink underwear as a sign of protest to the politicos who were trying to support and defend this violence upon women. It went on to become an extraordinary affair in 2007, where more than 1 million pink underwear was eventually sent to the houses of the politicos across the country. Different people used Facebook and Twitter to organize themselves. There were collection points. There were actually physical dumpsters in the cities where people used to go and dump pink underwear, which would then be shipped away and so on and so forth. Of course, it then went on to mainstream media attention, became extraordinary in terms of the kind of effects it had, talking about something that in India we very often gloss over, which is the whole question of gender in public spaces, right? Here is an example of how a really interesting viral strategy was deployed in order to create change of a particular kind. Except that we are still not sure what it did apart from raising the question up. Yeah? A lot of us who have worked with older feminist movements in the country, who have not only looked at questions of policy, but also looked at questions of cultural tolerance and so on and so forth, are often mystified about what beyond sending the pink underwear. That while it did mobilize a lot of people who would never have claimed a feminist position, and this is something that you see on Facebook all the time. I am not a feminist, but happy International Day to Women's Day to everyone. This is something that was going on last week. So it's just about trying to now try and see that while this was indeed an extraordinary way of bringing things into public attention, what about sustainability of the politics? What about trying to do something more which is just beyond sending off the pink underwear? There is another campaign which is really very similar to it. It's called I Never Ask For It. This belongs to another collective in Bangalore which is called the Blank Noise Project. The Blank Noise Project is also a project which deals with questions of gender, sexuality and public spaces. And one of the things in sexual violence in India has been that many different people, including courts, have said that if the woman was wearing those kinds of clothes, she was asking for it. It's actually been looked upon as a legitimate way of saying that women should be more covered and more protected and more demure and more modest. And if they just wore more clothes, nobody would ever get raped. So the I Never Ask For It campaign basically invites people to come onto the streets wearing clothes in which they had been sexually assaulted or violated in any form, and come and make stories around it. Saying, I wear this is what my body is, this is what my body's relationship with the larger public space is, but I do not ask for it. It's an extraordinary campaign which has more than 800 blog entries now by people in Bangalore, both by men and women, who talk about questions of safety and so on and so forth. Another really interesting idea which has now led to a lot of public discussion, even though it's at a more localized level within the city, for people to talk about these relationships, right? So, as far as the condition of participation is concerned, I think we're all there. That the digital technologies lead to mobilization of people who do participate in new forms of political engagements, that's fine. But the question of power always remains unanswered. That both of these campaigns, which were ostentatiously negotiations of power, actually end up becoming nothing more than spectacles of negotiation with that power. Yeah? That they peter down really fast, and that's something that we wanted to problematize when it comes to the question of digital natives. The second side of things is, if you wanted to really challenge participation, which is necessarily a good thing, what I want to forward to you is the idea of participatory pornography. Has anybody seen new forms of digital pornography lately? Is that too personal a question to ask? No? But if we were to make a distinction between pornography online and online pornography, in terms of pornography which is shaped by the aesthetics of the digital, we're talking about two very different kinds of things. Yeah? So I'm not talking about adult material and its proliferation online, but actually different ways by which digital technologies bring together certain forms of collaborative pornography. Has anybody been on chat roulette lately? Do you know what chat roulette is? Okay, so chat roulette was this peer-to-peer program which allows you to connect your camera and your microphone with a random person on the other side. It can be anybody in that particular universe. And you have a split screen where you can see yourself and you can see the other person, and you can do a whole set of things with it. Right? But it's got interesting potentials. It's not merely a pornographic site. I once spent 15 minutes staring at a tortoise who was wearing a hat, and the hat said, "One day I will speak." And it's just impossible to resist it, right? What if the tortoise does speak one day, and you just keep on staring at it? But I just want to present to you the idea that participation has often been delegated only to the nicer sides of things on the internet, but it is essentially a condition of the internet itself. And so instead of glorifying saying that the internet leads to participation, we need to start looking at how participation leads to the internet. And that if it were not for participatory structures and collaborative structures, the World Wide Web as we know it would not exist. So we're trying to kind of invert that particular equation in talking about participation. Let's go on to collaboration and openness, which are necessarily nice things, right? Everybody needs to collaborate, we need to build open infrastructures, governments must put out more information that citizens can use it, and in the middle of all this, we have participants from Taiwan and China who tell us the horrifying story of human flesh search engines or Ran Rao So So Yin Ching. Is this something that's traveled in the US yet? The human flesh search engine? Okay, let me give you some goosebumps today. In 2009, in China, there appeared a video of this 16 or 17-year-old petite, very, very nicely dressed woman who was stroking a small kitten and staring at the camera and smiling and talking pleasantly, performing affective labor. In the middle of the conversation, which was largely about the clothes that she likes and the shoes that she's bought today and so on, she puts the kitten down onto the ground, and then with her 6-inch stilettos, she starts bashing its heads out. So the entire video is about the kitten mewing, and she's stamping it viciously till the brains splatter out and the gore comes out and the kitten's dead. Right? It's a 4-minute long video. It's not for the faint of heart, but if you Google for it, you will find it and you'll be able to see it. You can just imagine how much rage it generated with people who saw it, right? In China, because there are no animal rights as of now, or at least no legalized animal rights, a lot of people got very angry that here was somebody who was committing a crime against humanity, is how it was phrased, and that she should be punished. They started something called the Ran Rao So So Yin Ching, which was trying to basically use collaborative and open structures on the net in trying to identify who this woman is, and we should be punishing her. In the course of 6 months, 480,000 people tried to decode that video in trying to find the geography, the location, the IP address, the different indicators which are embedded within that particular structure to eventually narrow down onto the woman who had made that video. A mob of more than 20,000 people attacked her house for more than 3 weeks, eventually asking her to change her name, to ask for state protection and leave. It of course didn't help matters that her profession was that of a hospital nurse. But anyway, so this was the first phase of the human flesh search engine. The story only becomes darker after this, because in the next phase, so basically this became some sort of a vigilante group. They saw this particular form of bullying as victory, and they then started scouting for more people to avenge justice for. Somebody leaked out a story about, this is slightly complicated, a woman who married her sister's husband after the sister got divorced from the husband. Yeah? Okay, a woman who married her brother-in-law after her sister divorced him. Yeah, okay. So once that happened, it coincidentally also followed the storyline of a Beijing soap opera, which was becoming very popular, and which was inciting extreme amount of rage about this non-Chinese ways of being, this onslaught of globalized cultures and so on and so forth. And so they decided that they must now go and punish this woman. Again, more than 700,000 people registered for this human flesh search engine, and they started looking at things like marriage registries, divorce registries, open data about recent bridal weddings and so on and so forth. In 3.5 months, they actually located this woman. And then another crowd descended upon her, pelting stones at her, throwing eggs at her, toilet papering her house, and refusing to let her move out of her house, basically organizing for the 21st century witch hunt, which eventually led the woman to commit suicide. Everything that we thought was good about the digital has been involved and invoked in this particular process. It's questions of participation, mobilization, collaboration, openness, peer-to-peer, and cultural production. it is about tribal and mob mentalities of certain kinds. How are we going to deal with these questions now? How are we going to talk about digital natives in this apoliticized, foofly sort of a way where they exist in this limbo, doing their pretty things with their pretty gadgets, when there are these underbellies to the things that we are discussing? So the books kind of deal with these kinds of questions, drawing from case studies across the global south, working with a lot of people who were not only documenting these processes, but also were involved in these kinds of processes across the world. We are essentially trying to say that there is a certain way by which we need to stop talking about digital natives as a category and try to think of them as digital subjects. That whether you are immigrants or settlers, no matter which part of the world you are in, there are certain kinds of design and protocol choices that the digital technologies bring forward to you, and that there are extraordinary things which can be done with it. Some of them can be very positive, and some of them can be truly devastating, and how do we deal with it? So I'm just going to then briefly just run you through the structure of the book to give you a sense of what are the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So in the first volume, which is to be, we talk about questions of what does it mean to be a digital native in emerging ICT contexts where digital technologies cannot be taken for granted. It's a collection of academic essays, photo essays, case studies, interviews, discussions. The community has come up with different formats of dealing with these questions, so you might find the book interesting just to see what are the different ways in which young people are writing in a book, is what the response was when we said we're going to come out with it. But you might just want to have a look at it. The second, to think, offers new frameworks of trying to problematize things which have been associated with youth technology and change, and moving away from a certain politics of the benign, which operates so very easily when it comes to talking about the digital. That the digital always seems to veer towards a slightly progressive, liberal left, maybe slightly libertarian, things which are used by educated people to produce sensitive change, and that's not always the case. Trying to look at what the underbellies of them are. The third, which is to act, collects case studies from across the world, trying to look at not merely the superstar narratives, which have been more popular in the global narratives, but also looking at everyday practices of digital natives, which might be very small. That digital natives with a cause, with a question mark, was because we didn't want to say that there are only certain kinds of causes which are important. We didn't want to make a separation of citizenship, which often is at play when we talk about these things. Like if you look at all the examples I have given you, there is a normative citizenship, which is essentially about trying to respond to the state and making certain kinds of entitlements and rights out of it. There is an ethical citizenship, which would come up in the Anna Hazare sort of a campaign around corruption, where I am a part of corruption through my everyday pecuniary practices, but I can also make an ethical claim saying I'm fighting against corruption at the same time, right? So that I have a normative idea of who's a good citizen, and my ethical transgression is only a personal, once-in-a-way sort of a thing. And the third, like you would see in the human flesh search engine, is the idea of an affective citizenship, where it is my visceral, non-thinking, emotional responses which lead to material practices of a certain kind. And to act kind of looks at different kinds of case studies which might illustrate that in interesting ways. And the last book is called To Connect, which essentially talks about how there is a certain rhetoric of loneliness which comes with the internet. I think Sherry Turkle, did she write Alone Together earlier last year? Yeah, she did. Incredible book which talks Alone Together. It's a beautiful title. But there is also a certain way by which we feel alone, or especially the young people complain about how they feel alone when they actually want to produce infrastructure of change. Because they are just given all the technologies, all the gadgets, all the platforms, and then they are supposed to do it on their own. So To Connect actually opens up the dialogue of digital natives to other stakeholders, bringing in policymakers, bureaucrats, researchers, development aid agencies to talk about what are the other kinds of structures which are required, which is not just about the material physical infrastructure. Somebody in the book from Latin America talks about the right to disconnect, for example, and the overwhelming pressures of being connected online because you are termed as a digital native. Somebody else talks about the infrastructure of belonging, or the infrastructure of laws, and so on and so forth. And they're kind of having a conversation about what gets glossed over when the emphasis only remains on the digital and not really on the conditions that enable the digital, or the conditions that the bodies occupy in some way. Anyway, so that's about it. I wanted to throw up these different case studies and ideas in front of you. Thank you very much for your time, and this is my email address if you need to write to me to get copies of the books. Yeah, thank you.
So are there any questions or any discussions, any comments? Anyone want to boldly throw out a thought or question?
Website where they're putting the cameras on each other?
Chat roulette.
What was it called?
Chat roulette. It's like the Russian
Chat
roulette.
roulette.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about language as being, being able to communicate in English, or in a Latin script, in order to be a, quote, digital native. I mean, how do people cope in India if you're not an English speaker and if you're dealing with a Devanagari script language? Then can you really be a digital native?
Right now, given the infrastructure in the country, if you don't speak English, you're not online.
Okay.
It's also an affordability and class question. The only people who are online already have competence in English. However, we do work with the local Wikipedia chapter right now. It's registered out of the Center for Internet and Society office. And it's been really interesting because language is not merely about questions of facility, fluency, or access. While those are important factors, in a country like India, even if people have, let's say, lower competence in English speaking, English is such a mark of modernity, progress, class, sophistication, and so on, that they'd much rather write in bad English than in good Devanagari. Right? So that's one thing. The second, I think what has been more important, if you look at countries like Japan and China, where the input devices are in their basic scripts, life is much easier for people. But in fact, it's led to really interesting experiments where transliteration has become so easy. So much so now that a lot of informal Hindi, Gujarati, Marathi words that I know of appear in term papers written in English because they seem to be valid English terms which come in. Having said that, there is of course a huge problem in terms of not just language, but at least in India, which is the context I can speak about the most confidently, there are also problems of caste and sex and gender and sexuality and affordability and geopolitical locations. What the digital has brought to the fore in India especially is that there has been so many stratas that India lives in, and they've all become starkly visible to us, right? But the thing about all of those is that if you say that digital natives are defined only by people who have access to the technologies, for us it seems to be a little bit of reduction of thinking about how technologies operate. If we start thinking of technology as a paradigm or a condition within which we live, as opposed to technology as something that we use, then we have a slightly different definition of a digital native. And this is something that we've learned from the communities, where they've said that it's much more interesting to think about how, because of the presence of technology, if there has been a restructuring of your life, you are a digital native whether you like it or not. Yeah? Which I think is a really nice way of looking at it, because we do work with a lot of people who don't have 24/7 access to technologies, who are not connected to global networks. But their introduction to the digital technologies have led them to rethink their relationship with change, so that they are no longer the beneficiaries of change, but active stakeholders and agents of it in different ways. One of my favorite case studies about this is something from my own postdoctoral work, where I was looking at the city of Ahmedabad, which is the city I grew up in India. It's a round city which is kind of bifurcated by a river, so there is about 40 kilometers of shoreline around which informal settlements have grown. And along with the river, this is also the labor lifeline of the city. About 240,000 people who live there. And in order to build Ahmedabad as an IT city, to fit into India's larger campaigns of India Shining, you suddenly woke up to realize that 240,000 people are going to be evacuated from that place, because they need to build a skyline which matches the Pudong skyline in Shanghai, because it should look like an IT city and so on. So here is a whole lot of people who probably The interesting part was that there was no agitation about it, there were no protests, there was no demonstration against this particular act. And this is the same state where 20 years ago, because a dam was being built and 800 people were being evacuated, there was like a national level demonstration by people like Medha Patkar and Arundhati Roy and so on. So I was doing fieldwork trying to figure out why these people were ready to give away their sense of entitlement, their spaces of cultural belonging, their lifelines and so on and so forth. And one thing that constantly came up was, in Gujarati they would say, it's because of that internet. They didn't know what the internet was, and most of them had never seen a computer. They had cell phones and they had cable TV but not internet, right? But if we start looking at internet as producing these conditions of governance, of living, it restructures life for way more people than just people who have access to it. And one of the things, which is why we're trying to say, is maybe it's more fruitful to think of digital subjects rather than digital natives. And that's one of the ways in which we're trying to kind of understand that right now. Otherwise, as I was telling Annalie, we have this incredible document, and you should search for it. It's called India Vision 2020, where by 2020, we are supposed to become a smart state, not a wise state, not an intelligent state, but a smart state. And smart because it stands for simple, moral, accountable, responsible, and transparent. It's nice how acronyms work out that way. Anyway, and we already have like almost a $24 billion infrastructure development project which is going across the country right now. So we're not very concerned about people who are going to be left out. In fact, we are very concerned about people who are going to be forced to be online in the coming future.